Welcome to the Shade Chronicles, an anthology-style podcast featuring short works of fiction and serial prose, specifically with a sci-fi and horror flavor. Your hosts for the podcast are Derek Leffridge and Lawrence Trokey.
Hi, this is Derek Leffridge, and I would like to welcome you to the Shade Chronicles.
Hi, this is Lawrence Trokey, and I also want to welcome you and thank you for spending your time with us. Santa's Claus by Lawrence Trokey. He went over his list and then checked it twice, as he was in the habit of doing. He learned the hard way to double-check himself after the fiasco with Napoleon. Who knew if he gave the kid a set of toy soldiers that he would eventually try to take over the world? Ever since then, he made sure about everything he did. Mistakes made by someone of his influence and power could have devastating effects, so he did not take chances. His calculations all told him the same thing. He removed his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes, trying to erase what he saw on the page. The moon would be full at the 90-degree north latitude and 0-degree longitude for the next 2 weeks. The same 2 weeks leading up and through the winter solstice. He picked up the almost empty vial he had sitting on his desk. There were only a few precious drops of the potion left now, and no way to get more, not since the wizard died a few years ago. Pondicet had been getting weaker over the years, even though he refused to admit it or ask for help. There was nothing anyone could have done. His fate was tied to that of the planets, and if global warming was to continue unchecked in its progress, it was only a matter of time for Old Man Winter. Pondicet did give him one more vial of the potion before he died, and that lasted almost a decade. Now there was nothing to keep the beast in check. He would have to take measures, extreme measures, to make sure things did not get out of hand. Santa stood up from his desk to stretch and get another cup of cocoa. He grabbed a cookie from the plate where the carafe of cocoa sat on the credenza by his office door. God, he loved cookies, and the elves in the cafeteria sure knew how to make them. He nibbled on the cookie while he poured the cocoa into his cup. He realized he had to talk to her and make plans for how they would manage the next few weeks. She would know what to do. She always had a plan. Going back to his desk, he pressed the intercom and said,
"Gilana, please ask Mrs. Claus to come to my office right away."
"Yes, sir,"
Gilana replied. A few minutes later, she opened the door to his office. She was stunning, he thought. Every time he saw her, he was amazed at how great she looked after all this time. If you asked her what her secret was, she would say Pilates, but he knew better. She was a world-class athlete. Even better than that, the magic that had allowed him to live as long as he did also made her strong. Plus, she loved to work, and she could outwork any elf in the place. He stared at her for a moment, her muscular, slender figure wrapped in a Victorian-style belle dress. She outshined any princess he ever met. All the images of her adorning Christmas cards, decorations, in books and movies, they all had it wrong. Mrs. Claus was a stone-cold fox, not some pudgy, short housewife in an apron. He hoped they would still have more time together after all this was over, but he knew not to get his hopes up. "Hi, sweetie, what can I do for you?" Mrs. Claus asked with a smile.
"Please sit down, dear. We need to talk."
Santa gestured to the comfy, overstuffed chair.
"I didn't want to alarm you, so I kept this to myself for a few months until I knew I was sure. I want you to know I searched high and low for another solution, another way to handle this, but I came up short."
Her face dropped and she realized what he was talking about. "You don't mean—"
"Yes, I'm afraid I do. The potion given to us from the wizard has all but run out. There is no substitute that I can find. All the other remedies, excluding death of course, are not an option since we don't know the origin of the curse or the witch who is responsible for the curse. There is exorcism, but you know my standing in the church isn't what it used to be, so that really isn't an option either.
What about going to Jack or Peter or even the fairy? Maybe they have magic that can help.
Jack won't take my calls after the incident during the blizzard of 1888. Peter is too busy on Easter Island to be of any help. Besides, he's a rabbit. The fairy doesn't have really strong magic either. Just a big hedge fund to pay for all the teeth she collects. She's kinda creepy anyway.
Then the only thing left is what I suggested to you as a last resort. She leaned in over the desk and placed a hand on his.
Yes, we need to prepare the bunker. Tell the elves to get it ready.
It has been nearly a century and a half since Santa had an incident. As soon as the last one happened, he went to Pondasay to ask for help, and the old man gave him the potion. It didn't cure him, but it allowed him to remain in control and prevent any more incidents. He thought back to how it happened. It's amazing how fast your life can be changed forever. He was in Romania on Christmas Eve, he remembered. He had just come up the chimney of a home he was visiting and was stepping onto the pitched wood-shingled roof when he saw the beast. His sleigh was supposed to be in the yard of the home waiting for his return, but instead it was circling the home in the air above. It was a sign the reindeer were in distress. Something was terribly wrong. He scanned the yard of the home and saw it. A big, furry, wolf-like creature feasting on one of his reindeer. Its blood splattered all over the new fallen snow. Santa couldn't believe his eyes. This monster had just killed Blixen, Blixen's predecessor.
Ho, ho, holy shit!
Santa exclaimed. Normally a peaceful being, rage now filled Santa at the sight of his poor friend being ravaged by the demon. He picked up his bag and ran full out to the edge of the roof. He leapt into the air and swung his bag over his head. Santa landed in front of the beast and slammed his bag into him with the force of a freight train. The creature had no time to react. The bag filled with untold number of toys and its magical mass were enough to crush the beast's ribcage and send it flying back into the woods encircling the home. Santa looked down on the fallen reindeer and tears flooded his eyes. He wiped them away with his mittened hand and leaned down to touch the reindeer's head.
Goodbye, old friend,
he said solemnly as he stroked the fur of his forehead. He reached over and snapped off a silver bell from Blixen's harness. Next, he went into his bag and pulled out a small anvil and hammer. He quickly pounded the silver bell into a pointy spear tip. The next item he pulled from the bag was a long wooden staff and a strap of leather. Being the ultimate craftsman that he was, he quickly affixed the spear point to the staff with the leather strap. Wiping away more tears, Santa stood up and walked into the forest after the beast. He found it crawling along the forest floor away from the house. Its breathing was labored due to its injuries. Santa noticed its back had been broken when it collided with the thick trunk of a silver fir tree. Santa thought the tree would make a fine Christmas tree, though. He walked to the beast and straddled it. He raised the spear above his head and then thrust it down with all of his might into the creature's back. Bones splintered as the spear tip also ripped through flesh, fur, and ligaments, finally finding the creature's heart. The beast whirled with ungodly strength, knocking Santa over. As he fell, a clawed hand ripped down, slicing into Santa's forearm. Then it died. Santa watched as the beast slowly transformed back into the shape of a man, the poor soul who had fallen under the curse of the werewolf. He wrapped his arm and went back to retrieve his bag. It took several treats to lure the reindeer back to the yard so that he could continue his Yuletide mission. Santa looked at the scar on his arm as he sat behind the desk. He reached over to the intercom again and said,
Gilana, can you find Molostre for me and tell him to meet me in the stables?
Sure thing, Santa.
Gilana responded gleefully. He met Molostre in the feeding area of the stables.
Hi, Santa. What can I do for you?
The little elf was dressed in traditional elf attire, a long flowing robe adorned with intricate embroidery and delicate beading. He wore a pointy hat with a long tail and pointy-toed slippers that curled at the ends.
How many AR-15s are on the list this year?
Santa asked his chief elf. Molostre pulled an iPad from inside his robe and tapped it repeatedly for a second or two.
Inventory is pretty tight on those babies. Mostly American customers. Some Australians. We had a heck of a time just getting parts.
The elf continued to swipe and tap the iPad.
I need you to pull one and set it aside.
Santa said in a low voice, leaning in close to the elf.
That'll mean someone won't be very happy this Christmas.
The elf was surprised by Santa's request.
Find one that was going to someone who was just at the threshold of making the naughty list. We'll say they just didn't make the cut. We'll make it up to them next year.
Santa, what you're asking me to do is...
The elf struggled to come up with the words to explain his shock at such an odd request.
Mollustroy, it's important. Probably the most important thing I'll ever ask you to do.
Santa's insistence was followed by Mollustroy nodding his head in understanding.
Okay, Santa, I'll do it. Anything else?
The elf looked to Santa for more instruction.
Yes, make a clip of rounds with pure silver tips. Hollow points.
The next day, an hour before sundown, Santa and Mrs. Claus met at a wood building at the edge of the property they called the bunker. The structure was constructed with thick logs. It was box-shaped and had a flat roof. There was only a massive metal door, no windows, on its exterior. Mollustroy had a couple of the elves standing nearby, awaiting instructions. Santa, in his heavy red coat and fur-lined red cap, motioned for them to come near.
Boys, I need you to help Mrs. Claus and I with something. You won't understand why now, but it is important that you do exactly what we say. Can you do that?
Mollustroy spoke for the elves.
Sure, Santa, we trust you. How can we help?
Santa took them inside the bunker. On the far wall, heavy chains and shackles were hung. There was a wooden bench there as well. In the other corner, a wooden stool with a kerosene lamp was ready to light the interior space. Mrs. Claus instructed the elves to help shackle Santa while he sat on the bench. The elves were hesitant at first, but Santa encouraged them to do it. After a few minutes, Santa's hands and feet were bound in the shackles. Mrs. Claus ushered the elves outside. She came over and kissed Santa gently on the lips before she lit the lamp and then shut the door. Santa heard the latches fall into place, and he knew he was locked in. The elves built a fire outside of the bunker to keep Mrs. Claus warm. She stood there watching in the cold, pulling her cape tight against her as the moon rose over the horizon. From inside the building, the screaming started. The elves were shocked at the noise and frightened, but Mrs. Claus kept them calm. "Everything will be all right," she said. As the moon rose to its zenith, the screaming was replaced by growling and the rattling of chains. This went on for some time, then it slowed and eventually stopped. She had the elves stand watch at the building while she returned to the compound. She was back the next morning. She drove a sleigh pulled by 2 reindeer. The reindeer were skittish when they pulled up to the structure, but Mrs. Claus comforted them and they calmed down. 2 more elves came with Mrs. Claus, bringing cocoa and food to the elves that were guarding the bunker. Mrs. Claus went to the door and unlatched it. The elves watched from the warmth of the fire, eyes big with excitement and wonder. She emerged a moment later with Santa. His arm was around her, and she helped him walk to the sleigh. There were tears and rips in his winter robe, and the elves watched him in silence as he got into the sleigh and then pulled away with Mrs. Claus holding the reins. The pattern repeated itself for several days. Each evening, Santa would go into the bunker, get shackled and locked in for the night. Every morning, Mrs. Claus would take him back to the main house to recover from his nightly ritual. Finally, the winter solstice arrived, only a few days till Christmas. Everything else at Santa's workshop at the North Pole was operating as it should. The toys were being made ready for their delivery on Christmas Eve. The reindeer were checked and inspected to make sure they were in tip-top shape for the job ahead. Everything was on schedule and working as normal, except for the lack of Santa's oversight and supervision. Mrs. Claus stepped into his role while he rested in their quarters. Rumors spread around the workshop about Santa's evening trips to the bunker, and while a gossipy sort of folk, the news did not distract them because the elves had an excellent work ethic. Santa called Mollustroy to his bedroom, where he laid in bed, just having woke up from a nap. Mollustroy came as called, and Santa thanked him for coming.
I know you have questions, Mollustroy, but I need you to just wait a little longer for the answers.
Sure, Santa. Whenever you're ready, I can wait.
Mollustroy assured him.
Good man. Now listen, whatever happened to the rifle I asked you to put aside for me?
Malostroy stood up and went outside the bedroom for a second. He returned with a wrapped box that was quite long for him to carry. The wrapping paper was shiny and colorful.
Here it is, Santa. The bullets are loaded in the clip inside the box, too. Pure silver hollow points, just as you asked.
Excellent. I can always trust you, Malostroy. Efficient and thorough through and through.
Malostroy blushed at the compliment.
Thanks, Santa.
Put the box under my bed. It will be safe there.
Malostroy did as instructed. He bid Santa a good day and went back to work in the workshop. Later that day, as dusk was coming quickly since it was the shortest day of the year, he rejoined Santa and Mrs. Claus at the bunker for what he hoped was the last night. They took Santa into the bunker, chained him as before, lit the lamp, locked the massive door, and then waited outside as the moon rose. Mrs. Claus waited for the screaming to stop, and then she told the elves there, "I have to leave early tonight, boys. Still much to do before Christmas Eve. Please stay here and watch over things for me. I'll be back in the morning."
Yes, ma'am. We'll see you in the morning then.
Malostroy assured her things would be taken care of for her. After she had gone, Malostroy and the other two elves sat around the fire and listened to the growling and chain rattling going on inside. They tried to ignore it and not let it scare them, but they were all a little afraid of what raged inside the bunker. One of them produced a flask of peppermint schnapps, and they passed it around as they sat and waited. A few minutes later, they heard a yelp coming from inside the bunker. That caused them all to stand up and look at the bunker door.
What was that?
Amron asked, looking to Malostroy for answers since he was in charge.
I don't know, but it didn't sound good.
Malostroy responded. Just then, they noticed smoke coming from around the edges of the metal door. They all realized what was going on and started to panic.
There's a fire inside the bunker. He must have knocked over the kerosene lamp and started it.
Amron cried. Malostroy turned to Glenclaws, the other elf standing watch.
Go tell Mrs. Claus to come quickly.
Glenclaws ran off as instructed towards the compound. Malostroy then turned to Amron.
Get a bucket from the stables. We need to melt snow to put the fire out.
Amron ran as fast as he could to obey the command. Malostroy faced the massive door. He had to keep Santa from being burned alive inside. He reached towards the latch, his hands shaking from fear. He grabbed it and pulled it with all his might. The massive door swung open. Smoke billowed out from the inside. The fire, which had spread all over inside, erupted with the fresh source of oxygen provided by the open door. A low growl could be heard over the flames just then. Malostroy thought about running away, but it was too late. A giant wolf-like beast wearing a shredded red robe came through the opening of the doorway. The robe smoked and smoldered from the embers that littered its shoulders. The shackles were still around the beast's arms and legs, but the chains had all broken, having been melted to the point of failure. The beast swiped a massive hairy arm at Malostroy, and the claws of his hand dug deep into elven flesh. Amron ran into the stables and found a bucket. He turned to run back to the bunker when he noticed the reindeer getting jittery and nervous. He tried to calm them, but his efforts failed. They only became more excited and afraid. The one named Donner broke through the gate of his stall and ran past Amron towards the open main doors. A few steps beyond, and he was in the air climbing towards the sky, not looking back.
Oh no,
Amron said to himself as he ran after Donner. He got to the doors of the stable when he heard the growling of the beast. He turned just in time to see the sharp teeth of the monster light down on his face. Glenclaws came running up the steps of the Claus house, nearly out of breath. He stopped on the porch to try to recover from his sprint from the bunker. He took a second and then launched himself at the door, pounding on it and screaming for Mrs. Claus. A moment later, she opened the door and looked at Glenclaws' face. That was all it took for her to know what was wrong. There were other elves out that night who saw the fire consuming the bunker. They ran to the maintenance shed to retrieve the wagon with the water pump. As they were hitching a reindeer to pull the wagon to the bunker, they all heard the screams coming from the stables, and they froze. The reindeer started jumping in a state of fear, straining against the harness. A moment later, a low growling could be heard on the wind. It grew louder with every passing second, an indication that something terrible was getting closer. The reindeer made one last attempt to break free, but instead only managed to pull the wagon away from the elves, frozen in fear at the sound of the beast approaching. It ran away with the wagon in tow, leaving the elves to face their fate alone. Then, in the doorway of the maintenance shed, the silhouette of the beast appeared. Fresh blood dropped from its claws and snout. Its devilish eyes fell on the elves, lit by an unholy light from the very pit of hell. It took one step into the shed, and the elves embraced each other, waiting for their gruesome end. When it took the next step into the shed, a gunshot went off behind it. The beast whirled to face the source of the noise. Mrs. Claus stood a few steps away with the AR-15 rifle leveled at the monster. "Nicholas, please try to remember who you are. Don't make me destroy you." She used his real name, hoping it would penetrate through the layers of the beast that now ruled his body and mind. The werewolf turned to face her, his sharp teeth gleaming in the moonlight. His massive frame towered over her. He fixed his hellish eyes on her, while his muscles prepared to spring at her with unnatural speed and force. "I love you, Nick," she said, right as the beast lunged for her. She pulled the trigger and unloaded the entire clip into his raging form. Normally, the weapon would be semi-automatic, firing only one round at a time, but Malostroy had modified it for full automatic based on Santa's instructions. The burst sent 30 silver-tipped rounds into the chest of the raging beast. He fell at her feet, inches from slicing her throat with his claws. She kneeled down to his face as he rolled over to face her. His body now transformed back into the man she fell in love with so many centuries ago. She cradled his face in her hands and kissed him one last time as he breathed his last breath. Then she fell to the side, weeping uncontrollably for a long time. Elves from all over the compound came to the scene and stood in silence as she cried. Sometime later, the elves carried her back to her home and placed her in her bed. The sun was just starting to rise on the horizon by the time they had cleaned up the compound and buried the dead. The next day, with Christmas Eve still 2 days away, the elves and Mrs. Claus met at the large silver fir tree in the courtyard of the compound. It was a special tree, one that Santa himself had found and brought home while out one Christmas Eve many years ago. The mood was solemn, and the elves stood in silence with their caps removed. Mrs. Claus came forward to speak. "By now you all know about the terrible curse Santa had endured for many years. He kept this secret from you so as not to worry you, and for many years we were able to keep things in check. Today we mourn the loss of our beloved friends in the shadow of the greatest symbol of hope the world has ever known, the Christmas tree. You see, this tree is more than a decoration. It is a symbol of hope, family, and love. It reminds us we are never alone in such dark times. We have each other. Now, more than ever, we need each other for strength, inspiration, and love. Turn to each other now as I will turn to you. Let us hold on to each other until the pain of the tragedy passes and only the love remains. The love for those who have fallen, the love for those who remain now, and the love we extend to those we will serve in the next few days. If we let our sadness keep us from fulfilling our promise to the children of the world, then we are truly without hope. If we let ourselves fall into despair and fail to complete our task, then we are to be pitied. Santa knew you all were the most faithful, most trustworthy, most steadfast of any creatures who ever walked the earth. Join with me now as I will complete his mission to bring the world love, joy, and hope, if only for another day." The elves looked to each other after she finished. One by one, they began clapping and cheering to the point they were shouting at the tops of their lungs, laughing and dancing, ready to meet the challenge of another Christmas. When the cheering ended and the crowd thinned, Mrs. Claus stood staring at the beautiful tree in front of her for several minutes. Then her gaze shifted to look off into the distance at the moon rising slowly into the sky. She thought she heard the cry of an Arctic wolf, if only for a moment.